welcome to Afflictions Sugarcoated, a podcast where we sugarcoat some of the world's so-called afflictions and rate their plausibility on a scale of 1 to 5. I'm Minnie Kim, and today we'll be sugarcoating isolationism, specifically in the interwar period for the United States. So in my school, we do these little end-of-the-term papers called 331, 332, and 333. As you can guess, we have 3 terms per year, and essentially it's for 11th graders primarily to kind of assess any type of event or person, historical figure, etc., and just create a long paper out of it. And for us specifically, it was about 5 to 6 pages. I went on till 8 because there's just a lot of stuff to write about when it comes to isolationism. And essentially, I decided to write it about isolationism just out of a whim because I enjoy global politics, international relations, US politics, and foreign policy. But I never expected the timing to match up so perfectly in our recent endeavors as a country or as the administration's attempts to intervene in Iran. And whether that is successful or not, whether that was the correct decision or not, is obviously not mine to make. But it just got me pondering about what exactly isolationism is outside of the context of just my academic paper, but also in real life. And I guess my essay is quite the opposite of what is happening right now. I advocate for anti-isolationism. And this is, well, I guess it would be more beneficial for me to read it out first and then delve into the exact history of it. But let's just go over some quick history first because we always enjoy a bit of history or term defining in this scenario. So firstly, what is isolationism? Isolationism is a policy of avoiding political alliances, military commitments, deep involvement in international conflicts, and it's usually to protect domestic stability or to avoid foreign wars. But historically, isolationism rarely meant complete isolation. So countries often continued trade and diplomatic relations, and this, for example, happened during the interwar period for the United States, which is what I wrote about. And historians often distinguish between political isolationism as avoiding alliances and wars, economic isolationism, which is limiting trade and tariffs, strategic isolationism, which relies on geography and defense, and the United States often practiced political isolation, but oftentimes not economic isolationism. For example, there was always tariffs, there was always global banking. And the early roots of it came in older philosophical roots. So it came from George Washington, 1796, or at least some form of it emerged around then. And it's one of the earliest isolationist statements came from him saying it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. And that did not mean complete isolation, it just meant avoiding permanent alliances with European powers. And the US still heavily traded with Europe, as we know. And then we have something called the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, when James Monroe declared that Europe should not interfere with the Americas. And the core idea is that the US stays out of Europe and Europe stays out of the Western Hemisphere. So they're kind of separated in its own ways. And a quote from him is that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. And this became the foundation for 19th century American strategic isolationism. And isolationism after World War I is when things really start to change. The war produced massive disillusionment, and many Americans thought that, the war had been pointless, they were manipulated by elites, and Europe's conflicts were just endless on and on. And the major reasons for isolation is, of course, disillusionment with World War I. The Nye Committee investigated war profiteering, And secondly, there was this idea of pacifism and cultural trauma. There were writers of the lost generation like Hemingway, without, and they represented the undelusioned youth. And in terms of geographic confidence, the US believed that geography protected it, like the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, from the rest of the world. And there became this idea of Fortress America, in that there was an opportunity for America to not concern itself with the detriments of the world, such as the rise of fascism in this instance. And then came major isolationist policies like the League of Nations. For example, President Woodrow Wilson proposed it, and they ultimately did not pass it, which is actually a great tragedy, as I'll explain later. But then the reason why isolationism kind of cracked, at least the Fortress America that they thought that they had created, was because of the advances in technology, like aircraft, submarines, which reduced the ocean barriers. And a lot of people wrote that no neutrality legislation can give us the advantage of an isolation which does not, in fact, exist. But there was also this idea of moral responsibility. There were certain types of neutrality that just ignored the moral differences. For example, we can confidently say that Nazi Germany was not the greatest moral actor, and they rejected basic moral principles, and by rejecting that, America had also rejected the moral principle. And outside of the United States, we also see a lot of isolationism. With Japan, for example, their Sakoku policy, and in which from the 1600s and the 1850s, Japan closed itself to most foreign trade and influence, and foreigners were banned from even entering. And the purpose of this was to preserve political control and prevent Christian influence from spreading across. China, we have the late Qing isolation, where they limited foreign interaction for centuries, but Western powers eventually forced open trade through the Opium Wars. We have Britain with their splendid isolation. In the late 19th century, Britain avoided permanent alliances, and their goal was to maintain freedom of action, but this ended before World War One. Now, why did isolationism as a whole kind of just ultimately fail? Although there are a lot of arguments that it still exists, and it very much does still exist in the status quo, but not necessarily among, Western liberal democracies, other countries, except for maybe dictatorships. But even so, there is some sort of trade oftentimes that goes on there. And one reason could simply just be that there's a global economic interdependence among people. And, trade, finance, they tie nations together, and tariffs just overall kind of worsen global economic tensions, although they may have reason for them, as our recent president tried to endorse. And there were sometimes aggressive expansionist states, and fascist powers did not respect this neutrality, so people had to fight fire with fire sometimes. There were technological changes, and American power just grew as like another type of legacy that became very difficult to ignore. So the United States was kind of obliged, as a lot of people would say. Moving on to the stance that I took, the essay starts kind of like this. In the 1920s, the Glee Club of Columbus, Ohio, serenaded Republican politicians with a song addressed to Woodrow Wilson. The chorus went like this: wake up, your jobs in your own USA. These lyrics matched the majority of American sentiment and represented a brewing isolationist movement during the interwar period between the end of World War I and the brink of World War II. Exhausted by the losses of World War I and the Great Depression, America hung desperately to the idea that they must protect their own USA, and Congress followed through on this idea via refusing to join the League of Nations and instituting the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act and the Neutrality Acts. However, across the Atlantic Ocean, Europe was left bereft of an American aid to democracy, allowing for fascist leaders such as Hitler and Mussolini to take control. Although American isolationism during the interwar period reflected the democratic public will fueled by the fear of another World War I, protectionist policies worsened the American economy, and its legislation revealed America's untenable balance between political power and isolationism that ultimately left the world more vulnerable to the rise of fascism. And part one here is about fear and contempt from World War One. So one must examine why the isolationist movement gained traction in the first place. And the first component of that is fear and contempt. Interwar isolationism emerged as a democratic movement grounded in public disillusionment with World War I and irrational distrust in global politics. Now, still scarred from World War I, the idea of losing American men to an external conflict seemed repetitive of the mistakes made in the First Great War. Now, President Harding began this reform, claiming that America needed not heroics, but normalcy. And literature and news also allowed imagery of vivid fear to disseminate. In particular, one effective strategy was to blame the elites, riling up lower socioeconomic classes. John Dos Passos, an American novelist, described war to be, quote, a vast cancer fed by lies and self-seeking malignity on the part of those who don't do the fighting, condemning, end quote, condemning Wilson and the political majority for Americans' involvement in World War I. Hemingway also sympathized for the, quote, undisillusioned youth, end quote, allowing isolationists to condemn war by drawing from the experiences of the lost generation veterans. And this created a, quote, us versus them narrative within the United States, which made the political elite seem unbothered by war. The New York Times also contributed to this narrative by painting the vivid picture of, quote, mothers sobbing, men dying on barbed wire, fatherless children, young women with no hopes of marriage, and crowded military hospitals, end quote. Now here anger is evoked, detailing the unnecessary deaths during World War II. However, the younger generation were most incentivized to prevent war as their lives were at stake. As shown in Cornell, where students sent a 6-foot-high tank to the White House with the message, Dear President Roosevelt, keep America out of war. As such, there was powerful rhetoric painting interventionism as an evil applicable to all generations. Simply put, the last thing that people wanted was another war, because too many lives had already been lost. Indeed, 71% of those surveyed in the Gallup poll in 1935 stated that there should be no intervention even if another nation was attacked, and that neutrality was the third most, quote, vital issue before the American people, end quote. Now, the second reason for contempt was distrust in global politics. Now, in addition to the rhetoric, was the fact that people would be losing lives for a foreign country. As Representative Schaefer of Colorado put it, the fathers and mothers of America would see their sons slaughtered or maimed on foreign battlefields in order to pull foreign nations' chestnuts out of the fire and make blood money for international bankers. To Americans, death for a foreign country seemed useless, especially when there was outright hatred for these countries. The Washington Post condemned French calls for help, calling Europe rapacious, revengeful, short-sighted, and selfish. And this applied especially for Britain, the empire they had fought back so hard decades ago to be free from. And anonymous authors wrote that, quote, never under God's will shall I lay down my life for the British imperialists, end quote. And such language brewed polarization against Europe. Another reason to hate Europe came from World War I. Novelist Louis Gannet explains that Europe can be blamed for World War I and was justified in having, quote, general contempt for the international race of diplomats, end quote. It is important to note here that the correlation of isolationist sentiment can be drawn closest to rhetoric directed at the lay public more than calculated strategy in keeping the world out of war. This paved the way for Americans' greatest blunder throughout the interwar period: refusal to join the League of Nations. Wilson, despite urging the public, left office being unable to convince them of its necessity, and the reason why this was a blunder will be expanded later. Even one president after Wilson, Roosevelt, who was widely proclaimed to be an interventionist, had to make a peace promise during election season, showing how effective irrational public opinion was. People were unwavering in America's need to be pacifist. This exact widespread public disillusionment hence created a need for absolute peace without regard for political tensions growing in the world. Avoiding war had been morphed into avoiding the world. Secondly, the push for domestic focus. The second component lies in the want to improve domestic conditions. Although isolationists attempted to preserve economic growth via protectionist policies such as tariffs, it ultimately dismantled global economic trade systems. The Great War had been costly, and American taxpayers were suddenly on the hook for $10 billion of debt that the Allies could not afford, adding to diplomatic contempt. A widespread statistic also overwhelmed Americans. Killing a single soldier had cost America about $25,000. Once again, the blame went to the elites. In Congress, Senator Vandenberg condemned costly conflicts, and Senator Turner claimed that the real enemy of America is our rich fellow citizen who is willing to plunge our country into war for his own selfish purpose. Historians such as Charles Beard believed in merchants' war profiteering, complaining that, quote, playthings of princes had to be set aside to face the mundane necessities of the nation, end quote. Reports from the Nye Committee, which I previously mentioned, proved Beard's claim, making war even less favorable for the average American worker. Hence, war became a greedy thing to support, with the elites seemingly benefiting from it and the men forced to die for them. Now, additionally, the Great Depression had left America destitute, with historian Barnes claiming that it was a greater threat to democracy than Prussianism or the last Kaiser. In the midst of the great economic disaster the United States had ever faced, the idea that resources would be diverted to foreign matters seemed ridiculous. Instead, Byrd argued that America should focus on tilling our own garden, which is, by the way, kind of like a reflection as I had a conversation with another one of my peers the other like couple of months ago actually when we were discussing Camus, how in Candide he says that they should cultivate their own garden. Indeed, the highest proponents of isolationism were the unemployed, people who felt most deprived domestically. Hence came two stances: create a fortress America, or avoid foreign entanglements but maintain trade. Legislation reflected the first stance, as the Emergency Tariff Act, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act, the Hoover's famous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act emerged. The latter act assumed the Depression originated abroad, and the tariffs would protect the United States. And this was consistent with the blame that was placed on international diplomacy, but it was clearly the wrong diagnosis and solution. 1,000 economists petitioned the act, and as it would increase domestic prices and invite the nations to compete with us in raising further barriers to trade, in other words, a trade war. The Democratic platform also condemned the tariffs, claiming that it created international economic hostilities, destroyed international trade, drove our factories into foreign countries, robbed the American farmer of his foreign markets, and increased his cost of production. However, the protectionist tariffs still went in place, resulting in a catastrophic 66% decline in world trade between 1929 and 1934, both destroying the American economy and weakening already fragile European democracies. Part 3. Contradiction of American power and policies. And this is kind of the part where I think the meat of the essay comes in. Although neutrality legislation sought to sever military and political ties with Europe, the structural realities of American power contradicted isolationism. Americans wanted pacifism, as in peace. Politicians saw the solution was isolationism, and this was a problem-solution mismatch because the causes of war in Europe could thrive without U.S. interventionism. For example, the Neutrality Acts, which the New York Times coined, quote, one of the most dangerous foreign policy ever written, appeared to the American public as taking one step further into reaching pacifism, but in fact it exacerbated the war by leaving Europe alone to fight fascism. This is because the Neutrality Act of 1935 explains how it must prohibit, quote, the export of arms to belligerent countries, end quote, but makes no specification of what those belligerent countries are. This prevented aid to Britain and France, which heavily depended on outside trade and support, thus favoring the fascist aggressors. The political divide on such an issue is clear in a congressional debate about repealing the Neutrality Acts when Senator Green called it, quote, an act of appeasement towards Hitler, end quote, while Senator Clark claimed that repeal would mean, quote, limitless, end quote, war. Indeed, there was sort of a complacency of American neutrality and belief that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean separating the United States from dangers. This belief that the United States was never in danger had caused politicians to underestimate the fascist rise. Hence, lingering isolationist sentiment persisted. In fact, politicians pointed to the rise of fascism as further justification for isolationism, claiming Europe should solve its own issues. Even in Congress, senators used propaganda to hinder the United States from joining the World Court, which would have helped hold aggressors accountable. Polls showed 62% of the public believing the United States should do everything it could to help Britain and France win the war except go to war itself. All of these efforts, including the blunder in not strengthening the League of Nations, quote, contributed to the making of World War II, according to modern historian Zeeler. Herein lies the contradiction of both wanting peace and global democracy, perhaps what led to the downfall of isolationism. As a 1939 Times magazine put it, there were memories of the futility of World War I and a growing distaste for the brutalities of fascism, and these two emotions exist side by side. Politicians and the public soon saw, however, that these two emotions could not exist side by side, and the latter emotion won. As the 1930s brewed more fascist sentiment on the rise, isolationist argument fell out of date, both morally and politically. First, morally. Isolationists could only argue that morality didn't matter in the face of dying French civilians, creating the image that they did not know right from wrong. After the Nazi takeover of France, American diplomat Bullitt asked, "Why are we sleeping, Americans? When are we going to tell our government that we want to defend our liberties, whatever the cost in money or blood?" America also owed its aid to Europe, as Senator Johnson claimed it was, quote, necessary to Europe's salvation, end quote. In addition, politicians framed World War II as a violation of national morality. Moviegoers were asked to sign cards pledging to do everything possible to combat Nazi espionage activities. Historian Thomas Bailey claimed that the Neutrality Acts were, quote, a betrayal of America's clear moral obligations and of the American people. Hence, there became a direct tie between preserving national liberty and intervening. Secondly, politically, as Senator Vandenberg argued, America could not fight fascism in Europe without entering the conflict with everything, including men and money. In other words, there was no middle ground that could satisfy the public polling of both wanting pacifism and isolationism. Even domestically, politicians became more convinced against isolationism. As historian George Soule puts it, the US was obliged to go to war to maintain its right not to go to war, as American liberty was also on the line. Roosevelt, now feeling less burdened by public sentiment, placed the blame on Americans by claiming that the peace of 90% of the world is being jeopardized by the remaining 10% who are threatening a breakdown of all international law. Finally, he broke the problem-solution mismatch and argued that changes in neutrality legislation would be more likely to maintain a free world, or pacifism. Hence came the end of isolationism, due to its both moral and political contradictions. Pearl Harbor is now attributed to the official end of U.S. isolationism. With a military attack on American soil, the argument that the two oceans had separated the war could no longer be made. Across the board, isolationists retreated, claiming that the efforts to apply the lessons of World War I had been futile. Because of Americans' irrationalities, fear, and protectionism, the public chased pacifism with the wrong solution, and these irrationalities had consequences. Contemporary historians blamed isolation for the severity of World War II. The New Republic condemned how isolationists joyously hounded Woodrow Wilson to his grave, and the cost was a Second World War. Senator Lodge called isolationism the Great Betray, and the ambassador of Spain claimed Americans, quote, wrecked the League of Nations, both arguing that isolationism was in some ways responsible for World War II. Although a direct causation cannot be drawn, evidence suggests that America learned an important lesson during the interwar period. Preserving global peace and stability necessitates active engagement, whether that be interventionism or not. I give the sugarcoating of U.S. isolation during the interwar period a 2. This podcast was written and produced by me, Minnie Kim. If you have any comments or reviews, please feel free to write any and all thoughts in your podcast reviews. If you'd like to suggest an affliction for me to sugarcoat, please email me via afflictionssugarcoated@gmail.com. I know that last essay that I read to you was kind of ironic, given that the U.S. is far from isolationist, at least per March 5th, which is when I'm recording this. But I think that there's genuinely no answer on whether one should keep pacifism or not using isolation. I just know that if we are led by irrationalities and fears, as was happening during the interwar period, there's likely a chance that we're allowing bad things in the world to brew, such as fascism, such as Hitler, such as Mussolini. But the question of whether it can directly be attributed to America is unclear. But with that thought, I'll leave you to spend the next month with even brighter joys.